I'm happy to introduce Adam Rabinowitz. Adam Rabinowitz is an associate professor in the Department of Classics and assistant director of the Institute of Classical Archaeology at the University of Texas at Austin. He is an active field archaeologist and is involved with various projects related to the collection, management, and publication of digital archaeological data. As co-PI of the NEH and IMLS funded PeriodO project, which we'll hear about today, which seeks to build a gazetteer of historical period definitions. He is also an active participant in efforts to build infrastructure for the linked open data environment. And he'll be joined by his colleagues Ryan Shaw and Patrick Golden from UNC.
Thanks very much, Christine, and thank you and Michelle and Hillary for finding a way for us to give this presentation even under very different circumstances than all of us expected. Thank you all to those who have called in to watch this presentation. My plan is to talk for only about 20 or 25 minutes or so, and then Ryan and Patrick and I can answer questions, and if the conversation falters, I also have some demo material that I can share with everybody. So I want to talk about how I, as an archaeologist and not a library science professional, ended up in this particular role. And it was essentially out of frustration that was shared by Ryan, who is an information scientist, and by our colleague Eric Kansa at Open Context, which is a repository of archaeological data. And that frustration took the form of a desire to do for time what people had been doing very successfully in the linked data sphere for places. That is, to create unique identifiers and structured data representations of entities that could then be visualized and connected to each other. So I came to this from the perspective of archaeology in the Greco-Roman world, where a series of initiatives, including the Pelagios project, had created ways to join data with spatial references in external gazetteers. And there was nothing like that for time. So after a series of fortunate conversations between Ryan and Eric and myself, we decided to try to find a way to do that. Now, the problem had been that, at least in the field of archaeology, which I'm most familiar with, no one can agree on what a period actually means. We can generally agree that there is a place called Athens, and while we might quibble about its geographic coordinates on a precise level, we generally agree that it is in one particular place and that we're all talking about the same thing. So when we have a uniform resource identifier for it, we can refer to it with some confidence. The same is not true for periods, and that has stymied attempts to create single gazetteers that record all the periods that people are using as if they were phenomena, as if they were single entities. And the way that we decided to get around this was to try to talk not about periods as phenomena in time and space, but as discursive, conceptual entities. That is, entities defined by speech acts on the part of authorities. And that was what we brought to the NEH Office of the Digital Humanities in 2013, where we received our first funding, and the project that we continued with the IMLS from 2016 to 2018. Let me give you an example of the problem that we were facing. The existing landscape of period definitions, when we started talking about this, had either very broad linked data definitions or very narrow linked data definitions. So here's one of those extremes. The Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus contains a number of references to periods, but the periods, in order to accommodate all the possible local definitions, are very broad. So here you have a definition of the Iron Age that starts in some places in 1200 BCE, in other places in 1500 CE, and exists all over the world. So if you're trying to join up your Iron Age data with somebody else's Iron Age data, using a more specific definition, this is not going to be that helpful as an identifier. At the other end of the pole are definitions like those offered through linked data services with entities such as the English Heritage Organization, where you have very specific period definitions, but they're only good for particular regions of Britain. So if you're outside those regions, again, you have the same problem. So in order to get around this, we decided to try to model authoritative definitions of periods as discursive concepts. And we did this by using a data set that I had already been collecting in the context of another project and breaking down an assertion about a period into a source, an authority that makes that assertion, a label, the natural language term applied to it, ISO 8601 dates, parsed from the original natural language expression of dates in the authoritative source as 4-part dates, so they can express date ranges for both beginnings and ends. Some kind of statement of spatial coverage. Again, the original source makes a natural language statement of spatial coverage. We have attempted, where it was possible to do so, to parse that in terms of structured data representations in external gazetteers. And where we're dealing with sources that were already linked data, a connection to that linked data identifier in the other defined vocabulary or authority. So at its heart, PeriodO is just a big blob of structured textual data in the format that I just described. And as a representation in JSON or JSON-LD, you can see that those crucial elements, statement of temporal coverage in ISO 8601 Gregorian terms, a statement of geographic coverage wherever possible with reference to an external spatial gazetteer, a unique identifier that is both globally unique and persistent, and some connection either by citation or by linking to the OCLC or Crossref or another linked data source to the authority where that definition is expressed. We manage this through a series of components, and for those who have questions about the technical details, Ryan and Patrick, I think, will be happy to answer them in the Q&A session. We have a server that is hosting and generating that JSON-LD. We have a client, a graphic user interface that I shared videos of with this group yesterday, but feel free to explore those. I'll leave them open. And we've just revamped that. So you are the first group to see our new client. And a relationship with the EasyID system at the University of California Library, where we have a single ARC ID with a shoulder for PeriodO, and we manage the individual authorities and definitions within authorities through suffix pass-through. So we are now a tiny part of the linked data web. You can see us highlighted in red in the side of this giant sphere right over here. We're technically no longer linked to DBpedia, but to Wikidata. And our hope is that we can serve as a mediator between collections of information that has temporal attributes expressed in natural language. So not necessarily dates alone, but statements about periods to which, for example, objects in a museum belong. We've started this relationship with contexts in my frame of reference, primarily in the ancient world and in archaeology. One of our early partners was the Pleiades project. It's a spatial gazetteer that records somewhat more than 35,000 unique identifiers for ancient places. And we cooperated with them to represent their defined vocabulary for chronological periodization in PeriodO, and they now represent that in their own data sets. And we did the same, you can see the reference to the PeriodO identifier there. We did the same with Open Context, the platform that is built and run by Eric Kansa, whom I mentioned before, for individual collections, so that when Open Context ingests a new archaeological data set, that archaeological data set does not have to map its idiosyncratic periodization to some pre-existing predefined, true for everybody set of periods that are held in open context itself. And we've been working with both of those organizations to try to find ways to make it easier for them to manage periods through PeriodO, both by adding periods as new collections come in and reconciling them to their own schemata, and by finding ways to group or aggregate periods that we have or authorities that we have to create local collections that allow them to change and adapt their own internal defined vocabularies for periods. Now, one of the problems that we ran into, and if you've looked at the tutorial videos, you may have seen this, is that scholarly multivocality, I suppose is the nice way to talk about it. General state of contentious disagreement is another way to express it, has led to a proliferation of periods, even for periods that represent things that we think of as phenomena, shared concepts that we're all using. So archaic Greece was the example I used. If you simply search for archaic, you now return about 142 results from the PeriodO dataset. If you narrow that in time to rule out some of the really early stuff, you still get almost 100. And if you narrow it down to include only Greece, only the archaic period in Greece, you still get 17. And probably more in areas that are not represented in the faceted search that I did. So 17 archaic periods is probably more than any data manager needs. So one of the challenges that we've been facing is the request for some way to express a reference to the phenomenon, right? We're back to the beginning. People just want one archaic period that they can refer to and have a certain degree of confidence that everybody will agree that that is in fact the archaic period. So as a result of that initial phase of work, and up till now, the stuff that I've described has all took place under the NEH grant, we went to the IMLS with a proposal to expand the usefulness of this platform, especially to the GLAM community, galleries, libraries, museums. And what we wanted to do was create some toolkits that would make it easier for people to reconcile their data with PeriodO, to manage data collections or period collections in PeriodO with respect to their own data. We wanted to make it possible to have a more nuanced representation of individual period definitions, both in terms of internal relationships between broader and narrower concepts, that is periods and subperiods, and in terms of relationships between collections, so that people could express a derivative relationship where one scholar said, I am using scholar X's definition for my period Y, but I've changed the beginning and end dates because I don't agree with those, which happens all the time. And in the context of this, we have been slowly building a scholarly genealogy that extends these definitions back in time. And our current earliest set of periodizations come from Joseph Priestley's famous chart of world history. So we're working our way backwards to see how periods change over time, which is an interesting question of intellectual history in itself. We also propose to create new visualizations to make it possible to see different relationships or make it easier to see certain kinds of relationships, and to use the data set that we're building, which now has more than 6,400 individual unique period definitions in it, as a training data set for machine learning and named entity recognition approaches to text corpora. And we also eventually would like to make it possible to start aggregating periodized data. This is the mediating function that I talked about at the beginning, and we're still a ways off from that, but I think we're a little bit closer. So in the course of that second phase, we achieved most of those goals. You can come and see what we've been working on at our GitHub repository, which is located here. And I'll just touch on some of the highlights. We now have a reconciliation service, both through OpenRefine, through the graphic user interface, and a Python library that allows that to be automated if people want to work directly with code to reconcile their materials. And although you can download the necessary materials and run this on your local machine, Ryan has suggested that anybody who would like to reconcile data sets get in touch with us directly, and specifically with him, both because we are still doing some tweaking to the reconciliation service, and because it's really interesting to us to see what use cases people have as they are trying to match up their data, and where the pain points still are in the alignment of external data sets to existing data sources in PeriodO. So this is, for example, an attempt to reconcile somebody's archaic period on Cyprus. And even on Cyprus, you still have a series of different options. But this allows you to state, at least more clearly by aligning your value as a close match with one of the PeriodO values, what you mean when you use that particular term. We were also able to leverage some existing digital humanities visualization infrastructure to create new visualization tools. And specifically, we worked with the group at Stanford that created the PeriodO digital humanities visualization platform to use some of their timeline visualization tools and to adapt some of the outputs of the export formats of PeriodO to match with what PeriodO expects. So you can download a CSV file of one of our authorities and quickly upload it into PeriodO and visualize it as a map and timeline. We expanded our data model in the way that we described. And so now if you want to add a new period, you are able to make broader, narrower relationships with between that period and a period that might be its parent or child. And you're also able to relate that period to an existing definition in another data source. So if you have Scholar X saying that period Y is based on the definition offered by Scholar Z, you can now represent that in our data model. And we're hoping to, again, build this out as a sort of a graph of scholarly influence, at least on the level of periodization. There's those two new elements in our data model. And I will talk very briefly about what we've been doing with named entity recognition and some natural language processing. Our idea was that we refer all the time to periods by natural language terms within discursive communities where we assume everybody knows what we mean when we use those terms. So I just grabbed the list of papers in a session offered at the annual meeting of the Archaeological Institute of America a few years back. And you can see that lots of these papers make reference to period terms. Those period terms are located in both space and time, but neither space nor time show up in many of these. So if you wanted to find space, you would have to find some reference in a gazetteer to synop. And if you wanted to find time, you'd need to do the same with those periods. And you would have to find a way to guess whether their archaic period was one that is prevalent in a particular area versus one that's prevalent in another area. So we'd hope to create some machine learning tools and data sets that would approach this from a probabilistic basis. We haven't quite gotten there, although I have some hopes with colleagues in computer science at UT. But over the last 6 months, I have been able to work in the context of a project, PaleoTexas, that falls under the larger heading of a grand challenge at the University of Texas at Austin called Planet Texas 2050, which is an attempt to figure out how we can make Texas resilient and habitable and equitable by the time we get to the mid-century, with less water, more people, denser urban environments, and more extreme weather in various places. And so what we did in this case, in order to assess the chronological patterns of settlement on the Edwards Plateau of Central Texas, was to scrape the text from a corpus of gray literature archaeological reports to come up with a short list of structured data representations of periods that are applicable to Central Texas. And then the undergraduate student, Zach Dorff, with whom I've been working, built some Python libraries to essentially carry out regular expression work over this corpus to identify the use of period terms and then to associate those period terms with both site identifiers in the literature and the PeriodO identifiers with their chronological boundaries. The result of this was a list of around 3,000 coincidences between site identifiers and defined period terms. Some of this highlighted some of the areas that we recognize to be potentially problematic for us. So if you look at the output, the CSV output of that named entity recognition process, you'll see that there's no entity for prehistoric, because none of the sources that we're using actually specified what they meant by prehistoric. And so we had to fudge this by taking the earliest and latest date ranges of everything that wasn't historic in those sources and using those dates as the range for those sites, which isn't very helpful because it stretches from the 13th millennium BC to yesterday. So what we could do, however, was extract some more precise, higher resolution data about space. And I just want to end by showing you what that allows us to do, and what would have been very difficult to do for the same student working his way slowly through all of these individual site reports and trying to keep a spreadsheet full of period references correlated with those sites. So instead, this extraction allowed us to really quickly make a map-based visualization of the development of settlement on the Edwards Plateau over time. And there's a lot of, this is a very rough visualization. It's a proof of concept. There are lots of problems with selection bias, where people chose to report dates or name periods, where archaeological work has been concentrated. But it does give you a sense of the possibilities for visualization if you can extract both space and time from unstructured text corpora, or for that matter, from structured data representations like library catalogs, where you might have references in the Library of Congress subject headings to periods. You might have dates embedded in those subject headings, but you don't have a structured data representation of the date ranges of those periods that you could allow, that you could use to represent the coverage of your bibliographic collection in terms of the periods that its works refer to. And I will end with thanks to a very large number of partners who have contributed to this as well, beyond the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the NEH Office of the Digital Humanities, to whom we are extraordinarily grateful. We have had lots of folks contribute data in our early years, help us refine our approach, participate in workshops and focus groups to help us figure out where users needed something other than what we thought they needed. And we hope to continue forward with both our existing partners and many new partners. And we welcome your questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Adam. So we're gonna give people a moment to type into the Q&A box. So, oh, there's a question there already from Jesse Lambertson. Thank you, Adam. Is a local copy of the data required, or is this best handled by API when matching and reconciling? I assume API to avoid duplicating anything. I know we are still making local caches of data available because of networking issues from time to time. I assume that this will always be a challenge. This question is also posted on Slack.
Great. Ryan, do you want to weigh in on that as well? So the OpenRefine sort of user reconciliation service requires you to download a copy of the data as it is. But some of the work that we did with the Python libraries, I think, is hitting the data as it lives on the server.
No. Actually, we don't make, can you hear me okay? We don't make a public reconciliation endpoint available because of our own resource constraints. So the way our reconciliation server is intended to be run is locally. So basically, when you start it, it downloads the most recent data set and runs on localhost, and then you're just running refine against that that local endpoint. And the Python command line reconciler works similarly. It's working with a local version of the data set. So there's not really any duplication because that's the same code that we use for reconciliation. It's just about where it's running.
Thanks so much for that answer. Let's see if there's any more questions. No more questions yet, but let's give it a couple of minutes. Found in other panels that waiting a second for people to type is necessary.
Christine, can I switch my screen share?
Oh yeah, sure, of course.
Because I think that if there aren't any other questions, I have some play along at home stuff that people can potentially do.
Please go.
I've lost my cursor here. And I'm going to put the shared link to that box folder into the chat.
Great, thank you. I think I also put it into Slack earlier.
I saw that.
Are you playing a video right now, and is there supposed to be sound?
No, I should just be showing my
You're just showing. Okay,
Firefox browser. No,
okay.
It's not doing. That's actually a live window.
Okay. Just checking. Sorry.
Well, let me actually. Sorry, I was waiting to see if there were any more questions, but let me briefly show you how you might add new periods to cover areas that we don't have. And so if we go to the canonical data set, you will see with the new maps that that Ryan produced that we are missing a little bit of Melanesia and Polynesia over here, Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. And so I've put some resources related to those. This is the sort of thing you might see and say, oh, well, we have a huge collection that's related to Oceania and no one is helping us with it. So that you might see how one can add new definitions. Did I see a Q&A question?
Yes, there's a question, and it sort of dovetails with what I was trying to formulate myself. This is a question from Adam Schiff. There are currently no sources on this list maintained by the Library of Congress, and he gives a link to the temporal sources in loc.gov. Would you mind if we ask for one so that PeriodO terms can be used in cataloging?
So we've got representations of all of the period subject headings in the Library of Congress, which are also the ones that appear in the FAST chronological vocabulary. And this is actually a huge desideratum for us because it would be fun to work with libraries to make widgets to help you explore the temporal coverage of the subjects of your works. We are going to get back with the Library of Congress. Library of Congress subject headings links back to PeriodO, but there's clearly a set of steps that we need to take to make it possible for libraries to have these as authorized subject terms. So I'm not sure, Adam, whether you were talking about the canonical collection or the Library of Congress subject headings, or is there something else that's missing that you're aware of from the Library of Congress linked data environment that we should think about including? I guess you'll have to respond by Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, I could grant Adam.
Oh no, I see what he's asking.
Okay.
Right. So I'm going to reach out to the Library of Congress, to one of our colleagues there who worked with us to get this into PeriodO, to see if maybe we can do that, because that would be great. We are in fact a vocabulary that is only about temporal terms.
Adam says, perfect. Thanks. And Jesse is saying in chat, I think this could really grow.
We would love to have feedback from this community. So it's interesting. I mean, I am neither a librarian nor an information scientist. I am an archaeologist who was frustrated by the fact that I couldn't represent things in time and space easily. But obviously I'm working with Ryan, who's in the School of Information Science at North Carolina, and we were partnered with the UT Libraries in this endeavor for the IMLS. But even the UT Libraries is still not using our period terms, I think for the reason that Adam Schiff has pointed out. And so any help that we could get from this community in measures that we could take to make what we're doing more useful and easier to adopt would be great, including feedback on the tutorial videos or on the mechanics. And I'm looking at the Q&A here, and I see Joan's question. Hi, Joan. Yes, we are a little thin on the ground in parts of Africa, especially in more recent periods. We have a lot of older sort of prehistoric terms there. We would love to have more pre-20th century period authorities in there, or period authorities from the first half of the 20th century. We're front-loaded on the late 20th and early 21st century sets of definitions. But again, for that scholarly genealogy to build ourselves backwards in time, that would be hugely useful. India as well, we've got some stuff for India, but mostly from external sources. And there is one desideratum that we haven't yet been able to manage, but would really like to do, and that is to record alternate ways of expressing time from indigenous communities. So to get outside of the Western scholarly tradition of periodization, and there may be insurmountable problems here in the ability to get from an indigenous mode of thinking to a Gregorian date parsing. And we'll deal with that. But we would love to enter into some conversations about how we can represent a wider range of languages, a wider range of concepts that aren't necessarily the ones that are canonically used in something like the Library of Congress subject headings.
So I'm wondering, for continued engagement with other communities, like what's the best way to engage with you? And also I'm thinking towards our library audience, whether there are folks who've been working in linked data environments, either in terms of like the PCC URIs and MARC project, or various wiki bases like the ones about Indigenous knowledge in Canada, or working in Sinopia on BibFrame descriptions, whether any of them see a need for this as, you know, something like a lookup in our questioning authority module, or so I guess my question to you, Adam, is besides wanting to start a conversation with other folks that can probably continue on Slack, is what's the best way to share our use cases, and also how can we like learn about the use cases that you've designed this around?
That's a really good question. So we've been managing a lot of this discussion, at least when it's not happening individually over email, through our GitHub issue tracker for various elements. And I wonder, Ryan, if that might not be a place where we would want to allow this to pick up. Ryan manages it, so I'm asking him.
I think that's a fine place for people who feel comfortable with the GitHub issue tracker. But we're also just happy, we're open to emails from people. So I think we're mainly interested in communicating with potential users. And so sort of whatever people feel comfortable with, and in terms of that is fine with me. We did have a mailing list, but I think you shut it down because it was not getting much traffic.
The university shut it down because nobody was ever using it. I would be happy to restart it though. It's easy enough to do. And that's another way that we might be able to have a sort of an easier conversation, and where people could throw up use cases as they go. And the interesting thing about this is, because we designed it as a sort of a community platform, we find out that people are using it who have never talked to us about it. And we get submissions of data from people that we've never talked to, sometimes quite large and complex submissions of data from various places all over the world. And they're still, I think, focused on the archaeological side, because we made a big mess of periodization. But this is something that it would also help to capture. And we want to make it as easy as possible for people to get in touch with us. There was a question about Chinese and Japanese states, and we have the China Historical GIS and the Library of Congress up here now, so you can take a look at that. But there's probably more precision. We were going to try to ingest at one point the Who Time Gazetteer for China, not for China, but for Japan. Is that right, Ryan?
Sorry, what was the question about Japan?
We were going to try to ingest the Who Time.
Yes, that's on the list. That's on the to-do list.
Yeah, the question specifically was, are you using dynastic reign dates for China, Japan, and Korea? And that came from Karen Smith Yoshimura. And Patrick answered it briefly in chat. There is also a question from Adam Schiff, or a suggestion about interacting with an ALA group, discussing whether to create its own temporal terms vocabulary. And there are a couple more questions in here. We do need to wrap up shortly, but just to say them out loud, maybe we can finish this in Slack later. From Tharwat Al-Olami, are you using a thesaurus for temporal terms, and are you covering Arab countries or Middle East history?
So we are not using one thesaurus, but ingesting any thesaurus we come across or that somebody shares with us, right? So again, our point is to say, here's an authority. This authority defines these periods in this way. And that authority might be a web project with a defined vocabulary. It might be a book. It might be some other thing altogether. We have too little coverage of the Arab world in Arabic. That's another area that we would love to have stuff. We've got a fair amount of material for the Ottoman period, including dates in Ottoman formats that somebody contributed because they were working on the Ottoman period. But we would love to have more Arabic stuff.
Awesome. So there were a couple more questions that folks are answering in the Q&A box. We do need to move on to our next presentation. Adam and Patrick and Ryan, thank you so much for this. This is really fantastic.
And thank you very much for including me in this conference and for organizing under very difficult circumstances. I think that things are working out quite well, and it's great to be a part of this, even at a distance. Although this was supposed to be local for me. I was supposed to just walk across campus. So what I want to do today is give an overview of Syriaca.org. We are a linked data project for the field of Syriac Studies. We produce authority files on, well, our current data set includes data on persons, places, works, and bibliography, mainly scholarly bibliography for the field. We have forthcoming projects on manuscripts and a taxonomy that will hopefully one day develop into more of a domain ontology for the field. We have born digital TEI encoded authority files on each of these entity types. I'll say a little bit about some of them. I probably won't spend a lot of time introducing all of them. But this is material that has been derived from ancient sources and modern scholarship. and encoded in TEI in a born digital format. So we're not encoding ancient texts, but rather encoding data from those texts. We use the TEI because we feel that it's really valuable for modeling the kinds of ambiguous material that we get from heterogeneous sources in the field. But we've also used the TEI very intentionally to leverage the capabilities of linked open data. And so I'll describe some of that to you and show you a little bit about the serialization stack that we use to go from our TEI data to HTML and to RDF and JSON. So that's kind of where we're headed here. So just very quickly, Syriac Studies. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic. It flourished from the 3rd to the 9th centuries, but also, well, primarily in the Middle East, but became a lingua franca that was used throughout the Middle East and Central Asia. Offers the 3rd largest corpus of textual material for the ancient and medieval world after Greek and Latin. It is still used by, liturgically at least, by Middle Eastern Christians today, and there are sizable expat communities in Europe and North America as well. These are primarily Christian communities that are in the Middle East. The Syrian civil war, ISIS, the invasion of Iraq have all been extremely challenging for these communities. And the point where this really becomes relevant to this issue of data is that there is no national library that has the mandate to create the kind of authority files that are needed. And so it's come to historians and scholars of religion and people in Near Eastern studies to produce this kind of material. And so this is primarily a scholarly driven research project that is creating the kinds of authority files that in many instances in other contexts exist because of national libraries. So it's this linked open data infrastructure and some of the ways related projects, partner projects are using that data that I want to demo today. So here's the landing page for our Syriac biographical dictionary. We have TEI encoded authority files on over 2,500 people, authors, saints, emperors, officials, but we also collect data on unnamed individuals, so anonymy, who appear in our texts. We mint a cool URI, so a URI that's resolvable by a browser to a human readable HTML version of our data. You can see here we have things like name variants, an abstract of information, and a variety of different kinds of links. So when we encode information about, in this case, Euphemia, a woman who lived in the 5th century, I believe 6th century, we make extensive use of other URIs from our system. So you can see here we have references to other people, places, and indeed to the works that mention the persons there. So here's a little bit of our TEI encoding. The TEI allows the embedding of these URIs in prose, but also in some more structured contexts that I'll show as well. Here we have a link to our new handbook of Syriac literature. This is our works data. We mint a URI for the sort of Platonic concept of the work. We're able to list things like name variants for that work, incipits, explicits, the beginning and ending, which are often used to identify sort of lesser known works. We can list editions, translations, manuscript witnesses, these kinds of things. And you'll note as well, and this is the case for all of our data, that we have a works cited selection on each page. So linking the assertions that we make about these conceptual entities to scholarly resources that have been produced by scholars. So here's an example of some of the more structured use of this data. You'll see here we have editions of the work, ancient versions, manuscripts. But in the ref attribute here on these relationships, you can see that we have used RDF vocabularies. I'll say a little bit more, although I won't talk extensively about RDF, but I'll say a little bit more about this coming up. But you can get a sense here of how we've used the TEI with a mindset to being able to produce usable linked data, usable by other projects. If we go back to another person record, this is a person about whom we know a lot more, and we have some other features that I want to point out as they're used here in our data. We have our URI. We list a number of name variants in multiple languages. We have Syriac and Arabic alongside various other European languages. We have a description that, once again, you can see makes use of other URIs, right? You can see how the data graph is built up and displayed as we do this. And we can list relationships as well. Here we have the works. This person that we're looking at right now, this is Ephraim the Syrian, a very prolific author. So we get links to all of the works that he produced. Relationships to places that allow us to put things on maps, drawing on our Gazetteer data. One of the things that I think is really important to note about the way this encoding and display works is that much of the data that appears on the individual person's page is actually drawn from our other records. So for example, this person record contains the work URIs that are pointed out here on the left, and the title is actually drawn from that work record. Likewise, with the place reference to, say, for example, Nisibis here on the right-hand side, things like the name, it's simply the URI is embedded in this TEI, and the name is drawn from the work record, the description. We include VIAF identifiers, and in fact, we share data with VIAF. And so based on that, we can indicate that WorldCat has, 2,488 works by this particular person, Ephraim. So again, the linked data is quite visible and available there. Not all of that is sort of built into our data set, but it's drawing on these other data sets as well. Here is the landing page for our Gazetteer. We have nearly 3,000 TEI encoded authority files on places, everything from settlements, regions, synagogues, churches, mosques, natural features, a whole range of different types of entities, place entities are appearing here in our data. Here's the page for the settlement of Edessa. You can see again the cool URI that is resolvable by a browser, name variants in different languages. Coordinates, most of our coordinates have been pulled from Pleiades, although not all of them, but we do share data with Pleiades. We once again have descriptions that incorporate URIs pointing to other entities, persons and places and works, and related places as well. Again, we have events with lots of links to our other data sets, attestations, religious communities, as well as links to external data on this entity. So you can see here links to Pleiades and Wikipedia, Wikidata via that as well. And as I mentioned a moment ago, all, or I should say almost all of our data is sourced at a pretty discrete level to a primary or secondary piece of source material. By using our bibliographic URIs for our bibliographic items, as well as page numbers and section numbers and those sorts of things. So all of that is listed here in our data as well. So the way the pages that you've been looking at are produced by another aspect of our project. We needed an XML database to run our project, and so we developed the Srophé App, which we're delighted is now, it's open source, it's now being used by multiple projects in a range of different fields. You can see a few listed here. Ours, there's a project on Chinese architecture, a gazetteer of the pre-Columbian Andes. The Poetess Archive is in the process of moving to Srophé. There's a journal in the field of Syriac Studies that's using this as well, and I'll show you one or two other projects here. It's built on ExistDB, which facilitates search and browse by multiple parameters, but also produces the HTML visualizations of the data graph that I've been demoing here. It also facilitates the serialization of this TEI data into RDF and to a bit of JSON as well. I would say our focus to date has very much been on the production of TEI XML data graph with a mind to moving this toward a more full-blown linked data projects. And so we're still pretty much in the early stages of serializing that data into RDF and JSON, but some of that is available. And the Srophé application is what manages that. It also provides API access to all of these various forms. So the TEI records, the RDF, the JSON as well. So this slide sort of models the scholarly process involved in Syriac.org. Data collection, moving from historical sources, and as I said, secondary scholarly research material on this as well. The encoding into TEI XML of these descriptions of data drawn from our historical sources and scholarly material, and then the serialization of that data into these various formats. So an HTML version that remains quite close to the TEI, that allows a human readable version of this, but also RDF serialization and JSON serialization, both of which are still sort of works in progress at the moment. We have some documentation at Syriac.org if you're interested in some more details on that. This slide, I'm worried that this is really difficult for you all to see on what might be fairly small screens. I can share a link to my slides afterward if you're interested in some of the RDF vocabularies that we're using. We have a bit of a challenge in how we are using these RDF vocabularies. First of all, one needs to find the right vocabularies. Ideally, vocabularies should be general, but they also need to reach the audiences that you need to reach. And so, for example, if you can look closely enough here, you'll see schema.org, SCOS, Dublin Core vocabulary used, but also log, the linked ancient world data. And I'm not sure SNAP is mentioned here, but we do use at Syriac.org the standards for networking ancient prosopographies. They're the kind of folks who are most likely to be interested in our data, and so we want to make sure that it's available to them. Moreover, something like FOF does a pretty lousy job of describing relationships that come about from things like slaveholding, which were really quite common in the ancient world. And so we need the kind of RDF vocabulary that accurately describes the type of, in that case, relationships between person entities in the field. So we use a fairly broad range of RDF vocabularies to describe our data. We have quite a range of project partners. I've listed some here. This certainly isn't all of them, but all of these listed here are in one way or another making use of Syriac.org URIs. Some of these projects are actually using Syriac.org URIs for their own unique identifiers. Others have sort of a crosswalk between their IDs and our IDs. I want to talk just briefly about the two on the top left, just to show you how other projects are incorporating this data. The first is the Digital Syriac Corpus. This is another Srophé-based project that collects and encodes TEI primary source texts from Syriac. This is a text by Ephraim the Syrian. You can see here that the corpus mints its own cool URI that's resolvable to this page that contains the text, but it also uses the Syriac.org work URIs. And what this does is it allows users of the Syriac text to get linked back to the kinds of information we saw on the works page, editions, translations, additional bibliography, those sorts of things. There are plans to develop critical editions. Right now, we don't have critical editions. We mainly have transcriptions of open source texts that are available in Syriac. But when we get the development of more involved critical editions, they will almost certainly use Syriaca.org person and place URIs and marking up the texts, those kinds of things. The corpus also employs CTS URNs in structuring their text, which allows the return via the CTS API of specific pieces of Syriac text. And I'm not demoing any of that today here, but there are some parts of Syriaca.org that use that feature to actually draw in pieces of primary source text in Syriac and display it back on Syriaca.org pages. We find this to be a really nice model of how linked open data can facilitate sort of semi-autonomous projects working pretty closely together to produce data. Another project that we have been somewhat involved with is the Gorgias Encyclopedic Dictionary of the Syriac Heritage. This is the first encyclopedia of the Syriac tradition. It's available in print. The publisher worked with us to help them develop a TEI encoded, freely available resource of this encyclopedic dictionary. You can see here in the central column that the TEI encoded body of that encyclopedia article. The hyperlinks there take users within this encyclopedic dictionary to other headwords. But in addition to that, the TEI encoding also makes use of Syriaca.org headwords, or of Syriaca.org URIs, which has allowed us to then develop this linked open data plugin that any project using Syriaca.org URIs can incorporate into their web page. And it returns information on the data that Syriaca.org holds about these particular entities. So related citations means that we have citations, bibliographic references about that entity. And related subjects means that other authority files in Syriaca.org use that URI for that entity in their encoding. So we can provide users with access to this linked data graph available at Syriaca.org. We are in the process of ingesting and hosting for another project a very sizable collection of bibliographic data, which will dramatically increase the amount of information that we can return to users. So again, another example of a project that's semi-autonomous, but is able to provide a much richer set of data for their users based on engaging with our URIs. I'm presenting here the work of many colleagues, far too many to list. We do list them on our website, but these are our editorial committee and our research staff. Winona Selesky is the developer of the Srophé app and has just been an amazing developer for us. We've had support and funding from these groups as well. Here, in particular, the National Endowment for the Humanities has been a tremendous asset and has helped tremendously with this project. I'll share these slides, so I won't really spend any time on this and the bibliography. But I think that brings me to the close here, and I will look for some questions. I've got a couple of different screens at work here, so my apologies if I'm not looking at the camera all of the time.
Thank you. That was amazing. Yeah, I think we're a little bit over time, which is entirely my fault. We'll wait a couple minutes to see if there are any questions that come up in the Q&A. I fully understand if people need to run to another session, metaphorically speaking, but if folks want to stick around, I'm happy to facilitate the Q&A. I had a question for you off the bat, which is, in case, I'm not sure if I just missed it or something, what vocabularies are you using to describe bibliographic data? I saw that you had, embodiments of works and like editions, and I was curious what choices you made around that.
Yeah, so we have found it kind of necessary to use a variety of different. So I mean, all the usual suspects are at work. Some I mentioned, additional ones would be, I don't think I mentioned anything with OWL or fervor, but we do use some of these as well. We have a particularly challenging situation with these ancient sources that, and actually one of these papers here, I guess it's still up on my shared, whoops, sorry, I put something in front of my screen there. It's still up on my shared screen. From manuscript catalogs to a handbook of Syriac literature. We talk extensively in this article about different vocabularies that are used, and in particular the problems of what we have decided to call literary traditions. So a nice example of this would be something like the Gospels. Well, what are the Gospels? They are a work, but they're also a literary tradition. And so if you open up most Bibles that you might find on a shelf today, it would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But as we all know, there are countless other Gospels, and different traditions have included them as authoritative texts or not. There was a time in the Syriac world when it was quite common to use what's called the diatessaron, which was a single gospel that was drawn from the four Gospels and put into one straightforward narrative. So we've worked out all the different kinds of relationships, but we've drawn on quite a few different vocabularies in order to be able to accurately represent the different types of entities we have and the different relationships between them. So that top article there would be a great place to look for the kind of detailed answer to that question.
Great, thanks. I'll follow up with that.
Thank you. And I'm looking for where I have my, where I can post this link here. I'm sorry I didn't get it posted earlier.
You can, I mean, if you want to drop the link into the chat, that's great. If you want to drop it into Slack, that's also great. And I can send you instructions for adding it to the SCED page, because that'll persist for a while.
Did I just put it into Slack? I think I did.
I think you did. Hold on.
Okay, and I can,
yeah, you
here
did.
we go. I'm just managing to get my,
So let's give it one more minute, but after that, I think we can chalk it up to post-lunch sleepiness and a lot of presentations today. I have this sneaking suspicion that everybody has like 3 Zoom windows going on right now.
Yeah,
this was really great. Will you check it on Slack later if people have questions?
Sure, absolutely. Be glad to.
Now, this was a really cool demonstration of how you know, doing things with TEI texts can like feed into what is ultimately, you know, metadata that seems like really useful from a library perspective, but like totally outside of the sort of published model that we have for you know, a lot of monographs and the way that we think about these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is cool.
One of the things that I'm particularly excited about is the ultimate development of what exists at the moment as effectively a TEI encoded keyword list. But it's drawn from this bibliographic data set that I mentioned that has evolved over 50 years in the field of Syriac studies and has close to 15,000 items, a lot of articles and monographs as well. And to be able to integrate that into our data graph is going to be pretty remarkable. And we're working out ways to crosswalk that to all the things mentioned in the last paper, DNB and LOC and others as well. So yeah, we're excited about where this can go in terms of really providing robust linked data.
Very cool. Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see where this goes. Thanks for this presentation. I am going to switch us to our slide that says that we're on a break, so that everybody hopefully at least. Oh, hey, there's one question. It's very informative, Danielle. I'm a Middle East cataloging librarian. Do you have any cooperation with libraries, heritage centers, or churches in the Middle East? After this question, we will switch to a break, though.
Okay, very good. Yeah, we do. So. Beit Mardutho is well, it's many things. It's a publishing company, ultimately related to Gorgias Press, but it's a Syriac research institute. It's based in New Jersey, but very much connected to things that are going on in the Middle East. You know, many of the Syriac texts that are available in this corpus project that colleagues run were produced, were keyed in by monks in the Middle East. And we do have some relationships, not the kind of robust library relationships I would like us to have ideally, but we're certainly working on those kinds of connections. So yeah, if you have ideas or suggestions about how we can break further into that world, I'd be very pleased to hear about them.
And there's one more question. And about in Laud, which is an ontology that I'm actually not super familiar with. In Laud, a conceptual work is considered a Ferber work, but it is not clear what written work should be considered in Ferber terms. Do you have the requirement to distinguish Laud written works in Ferber expressions and Ferber manifestations, e.g. for manuscripts? And we're really ending.
Yes, I'm not directly involved in our manuscript encoding, which is also forthcoming. I'm not entirely certain all those specific decisions have been made, and I will refer you to that first article, which may or may not still be up on the screen, for the decisions that we've made for our handbook, which does refer to manuscript instances of those conceptual entities that are the work. I cannot off the top of my head recall exactly the decisions we've made. My research focuses on a different aspect of the project. So those very specific questions about the vocabularies that we've used in particular instances aren't fresh enough at my fingertips. My apologies.
No worries. Thanks so much for this presentation and for sticking around for Q&A.